Ology is the study of living things. Ology meaning the science or study of, and bio literally meaning life. But choosing to name something the study of life begs the question, how exactly do you define what is alive? Well, we decided on 5 main traits that are characteristic of living things. You might hear about more in other classes, but for our purposes in general biology or cell biology, this is all you need to know for right now. The 5 traits are 1. That the thing is made of cells, 2. That it has metabolism, 3. That it has DNA and RNA, 4. That it has directed motion in response to stimulus, and 5. That it can reproduce and grow. Let's take a look at that first trait, being made of cells. We'll look at the specifics of cells later on, but an important thing to know is that living things can be either made of many cells, multicellular, or only one cell, unicellular. Unicellular organisms are entirely independent individual cells, though they may also form colonies. However, we care more about multicellular organisms. The cells of these organisms are extremely specialized, and they all work together to keep the entire organism running smoothly. Each individual cell is able to communicate with one another and is controlled by what we call signal factors, which is just a fancy word for chemicals. A signal factor you might know about is insulin, which commands cells to eat and take in sugar. The next thing we'll look at is metabolism. This is really just a fancy name for all the various chemical reactions happening within an organism. For the most part, when we talk about metabolism, we're going to be talking about eating or food, since a lot of the chemical reactions have to do with converting food into little pieces that cells can use. Cells obviously can't eat a whole pizza on their own, so that food needs to get broken down into smaller parts that the cells can actually eat. We call these smaller parts biological molecules, and they include things like sugars and proteins. When an organism does this, we call it heterotrophic. Animals, for example, are heterotrophic because they eat other things to get the nutrients or biological molecules they need. Some organisms, however, don't need to eat other things. Instead, they can take non-living matter out of the world around them, like air, sunlight, and water, and turn it into some of those little parts or biological molecules. These organisms are called autotrophic, and they make their own nutrients from scratch. Plants, for example, do this via photosynthesis, which we'll talk about later. Now we'll look at DNA and RNA. These, essentially, are recipes for how to make proteins. We'll get into the nitty-gritty details about these later, but for now you should know how different organisms store their DNA. Some store it in a special little house called the nucleus. These organisms are called eukaryotic, and they're kind of like dumplings. The DNA is kept wrapped up like dumpling filling. Other organisms, however, leave their DNA free-floating around inside the cell. These are called prokaryotic, and they're more like noodle soup with the DNA noodles just kind of suspended inside the cell. Now we're on to the final 2 attributes of living things, both pretty simple. The first is directed motion in response to stimulus, which is some fancy words to essentially say that if you poke something, it's going to move and it's going to do it on purpose. If you poke a rock, it might fall down a hill because that's where gravity takes it. But if you poke a fish, it'll quickly swim the opposite way so as to not get poked again. The rock isn't alive, but because the fish moves with purpose, we say that it is. The last one is the ability to reproduce and grow. This might be through babies, or just making a copy of itself, or something else, but a defining feature of living things is that they can have some kind of offspring, and that offspring can then grow. Keep in mind, though, that as with many, many things in science, there may be exceptions to all of these rules. Plants, especially, do some really funky things, and bacteria and archaea, which we'll learn about in the next video, can be pretty strange. But we had to come up with some kind of guidelines for what to study in biology, so these 5 are some good ones to remember. And now you know what makes things alive.